Imagine waking up one day and discovering that a massive chunk of human history, entire fields of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy simply no longer exists. Not because it was never discovered, not because it was never written down, but because someone, somewhere, let it burn. That is not a hypothetical. That is history. Throughout the centuries, knowledge has been hidden, destroyed, denied, and buried, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. Ancient texts have been removed from the official record. Technologies that should not have existed have been locked away in museum basements. Maps that show things no one was supposed to know were quietly folded and forgotten. And the people who got too close to the truth were, in many cases, pushed out of the conversation entirely. This video is about 10 of the most shocking cases of banned and suppressed historical knowledge ever documented. Some of these stories are confirmed by archaeological evidence. Others are still fiercely debated. But all of them share one thing in common. They point to a version of human history that is far older, far more advanced, and far more complicated than the version most of us were taught in school. We are starting with perhaps the greatest intellectual tragedy the world has ever known. A loss so vast that historians still argue about it more than 2,000 years later. And a fire that, depending on who you believe, may have set the entire human race back by centuries. There was a city once that the ancient world considered the center of everything. Alexandria was not just a port or a capital. It was an idea made real. A place where knowledge from every corner of the known world was meant to flow in, be recorded, studied, and preserved forever. The city sat on the northern coast of Egypt, where the Mediterranean Sea met the mouth of the Nile River. It was founded by Alexander the Great around 331 BCE, and after his death, it became the seat of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek rulers who governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Library of Alexandria was the crown of this city. It was not simply a collection of books. It was the largest and most ambitious knowledge project in the ancient world, a deliberate government-funded attempt to gather every written work in existence into one place. Ptolemy I, who founded the library sometime around 285 BCE, gave it a simple but staggering mission: collect everything. His agents traveled to Athens, to Babylon, to Carthage, to Persia, and to India. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were searched, and any scrolls found on board were confiscated and copied. The copies were returned to the travellers. The originals stayed. It was knowledge acquisition on an imperial scale. At its height, the library is estimated to have held between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls. The exact number is debated, partly because even counting them was complicated. A single scroll could contain one short poem or an entire multi-volume work. But the scope was breathtaking. There were texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, anatomy, theatre, law, geography, agriculture, and philosophy. There were histories of civilizations we have no other record of. There were medical procedures that Western medicine did not rediscover until the 18th century. There were star charts and geometric proofs that dropped out of human knowledge entirely after the library's fall and had to be independently re-derived by later scholars who had no idea the work had already been done. The library sat within a larger complex called the Mausion, a word that gives us the modern term museum. The Mausion was something like an ancient research university. Scholars were given stipends, housing, and full access to the collection. They ate their meals together and debated ideas in shared halls. Some of the most important scientific and mathematical discoveries in history were made within its walls. Eratosthenes, with the chief librarian during the 3rd century BCE, calculated the circumference of the Earth using the angle of shadows at different locations and arrived at a figure that was within about 2% of the actual measurement. Euclid wrote his foundational work on geometry there. Archimedes, who studied in Alexandria, developed principles of physics and engineering that would not be formally rediscovered in Europe until over 1,000 years later. Herophilus, a physician who worked at the Mouseion, conducted the first systematic anatomical studies of the human body, including the dissection of the human brain, centuries before any comparable work was attempted in Europe. This was a functioning center of human advancement. And then it was gone. The question of who destroyed the Library of Alexandria is one that historians have argued over for more than 2,000 years, and the honest answer is that there was probably not one single moment of destruction. The library appears to have suffered multiple serious blows across several centuries, each one taking something irreplaceable. The most famous culprit is Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Caesar was in Alexandria, caught up in a civil conflict between the Egyptian queen Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. During a battle near the harbor, Caesar ordered his own ships set on fire to prevent them from being captured. The fire spread. Ancient writer Plutarch, writing more than a century after the event, claimed that the fire destroyed a warehouse near the docks that held around 400,000 scrolls, reportedly a storage overflow of the main library's collection. Other ancient writers dispute this account. Some argue that the main library survived the harbour fire entirely and continued to function for several more centuries. Modern historians are divided on whether Caesar's fire caused any significant damage to the library at all, or whether Plutarch was either exaggerating or confusing the storage warehouse with the main institution. The second major blow came in 270 CE, when the Roman Emperor Aurelian suppressed a rebellion in Alexandria and destroyed much of the city's royal district, the Bruchaion, where the library was located. How much of the collection survived this event is unknown. The third significant event involves the Christian bishop Theophilus, who in 391 CE ordered the destruction of pagan temples and cultural sites in Alexandria, following an imperial decree permitting the demolition of non-Christian religious structures. The Serapeum, a daughter institution of the main library, was almost certainly destroyed at this time. Whether any remaining collection from the main library was also lost during this period is disputed. The final commonly cited destruction involves the Arab conquest of Egypt in 642 CE, led by the general Amr ibn al-As under the orders of the Caliph Omar. A later account, written several centuries after the event, claims that when asked what to do with the library, Omar is supposed to have said that if the books agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they contradicted it, they were dangerous. Either way, they should be burned. Most modern historians consider this account a fabrication written long after the fact, likely as anti-Islamic propaganda. There is no contemporaneous record of this event, and the Arab tradition was, on the whole, one of knowledge preservation rather than destruction. The most likely reality is this: the library declined slowly. Funding was cut over time as Roman power shifted away from Egypt and toward Constantinople. The Mouseion lost its imperial support. Scholars stopped coming. The collection was not actively maintained. Fire, neglect, politics, and conquest each took their share. By the time the Arab armies arrived in the 7th century, there may have been very little left to destroy. But what was actually lost? This is the question that aches. We know what survived from the ancient world by what we can still read today. We have the works of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and a handful of other Greek writers, but only a fraction of what they wrote. Aristotle is believed to have authored nearly 200 works. We have about 31. Of the more than 700 known plays written by ancient Greek dramatists, only 33 survive in complete form. The medical writings of Galen fill 20 volumes in modern translation. But ancient sources suggest he wrote far more, much of which disappeared. Works on engineering, agriculture, anatomy, metallurgy, and navigation from civilizations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East existed in Alexandria, and almost certainly did not survive. Historians who have tried to measure the intellectual setback caused by these losses have reached sobering conclusions. With some fields of knowledge, particularly in anatomy and mathematics, were essentially reset. Medieval European scholars working in the 12th and 13th centuries were startled to discover Arab translations of ancient Greek works that had been completely unknown to them, work that had already been completed in Alexandria in the 3rd century. BCE had to be fully redone 1,000 years later by people who had no idea it had already been done. The Library of Alexandria was not just a building. It was the closest the ancient world ever came to a permanent, organized, universal record of human thought. The idea that it could simply cease to exist, not dramatically, not all at once, but through the slow, grinding combination of fire, politics, and indifference, is one of the most painful lessons history has to offer. Some knowledge, once lost, is never recovered. The scrolls that burned in Alexandria did not regenerate themselves. The scholars who fled did not always find new homes, and the centuries that followed, sometimes called the Dark Ages in Europe, were spent slowly, painfully rebuilding a fraction of what had already been built and lost. The fire that stole the future was not necessarily a single spark. It was a long, slow dimming of a light that once burned brighter than anything else in the ancient world. And we are still, in some ways, finding our way back to where it left off. It started with a storm. In the spring of 1900, a small fleet of Greek sponge divers was making its way back from the coast of North Africa when the weather turned against them. They found shelter near a tiny, largely uninhabited island called Antikythera, a rocky strip of land sitting in the stretch of open sea between mainland Greece and the island of Crete. Waiting out the storm, one of the divers, a man named Elias Stadiatis, slipped into the water near the island's shore to survey the area. What he found roughly 45 meters below the surface was a shipwreck, and not an empty one. The wreck was enormous. Later, surveys would estimate the vessel had been nearly 50 meters long, one of the largest ancient ships ever discovered. It was lying on a sloped seabed, half buried in sediment, surrounded by a scattered field of extraordinary objects. Bronze and marble statues, glassware, pottery, jewelry, coins. The divers began recovering what they could, and over the months that followed, working with the Greek government, they brought up one of the richest collections of ancient artifacts ever pulled from the sea floor. Among the debris was something that looked, at first, like a lump of corroded rock, roughly the size of a large shoebox, encrusted with centuries of seabed deposits. When it arrived at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, it was set aside alongside the more visually impressive pieces, the statues, the bronzes, and largely left alone. No one quite knew what to make of it. Then, months later, the crust began to crack and dry. The objects split open, and inside were gears. Bronze gears, with precisely cut triangular teeth. Dials engraved with Greek letters and astronomical symbols. Axles, pins, and interlocking wheels arranged in a configuration that no one in 1900 could explain. The museum catalogued it as an astronomical instrument of some kind and moved on. For decades, it sat in a display case with minimal annotation while the bronze statues next to it drew crowds and attention. It would remain that way for more than 50 years. In 1951, a British physicist and science historian named Derek de Solla Price came to Athens to examine what had by then been identified as the Antikythera Mechanism. Price was not an archaeologist. He was a man trained to understand how complex systems worked. And when he looked at the fragments, 82 separate pieces had been identified by then, he recognized something that the museum curators had not. This was not a simple astronomical dial or a decorative instrument. This was a calculating machine, a mechanical computer built from bronze, designed to model the movements of the heavens with a precision that had absolutely no business existing in the ancient world. Price spent years studying the fragments. In 1974, he published a detailed analysis in which he estimated the device contained at least 30 gears arranged in an interlocking system capable of performing multiple simultaneous calculations. The front of the device, he argued, showed a dial tracking the position of the sun and moon through the Greek zodiac. The back contained two large spiral dials, one tracking a 19-year cycle called the Metonic cycle, which the ancient Greeks used to align the solar and lunar calendars, and a second tracking an 18-year cycle called the Saros cycle, used to predict solar and lunar eclipses. A smaller subsidiary dial tracked the Calippic cycle of 76 years, and another tracked the 4-year Olympic cycle, the calendar used to schedule the ancient games. Let that sink in for a moment. This object, built sometime around the 1st or 2nd century BCE, could tell you where the sun and moon were in the sky on any given date. It could tell you when the next eclipse would occur. It could track multiple interlocking astronomical periods simultaneously. And it did all of this through a hand-cranked system of bronze gears small enough to fit in a wooden box that a person could carry under one arm. The level of precision involved was extraordinary. The gear teeth are cut at angles that modern engineers have measured and found to be accurate to within fractions of a degree. The tooth counts on individual gears reflect specific mathematical ratios derived from centuries of Greek astronomical observation. The device was not a rough approximation. It was a highly refined, carefully calibrated instrument, built by someone who understood both the mathematics of astronomy and the mechanics of precision metalworking at a level that history had told us simply did not exist yet. Price himself described it as being like finding a jet plane in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Nothing in the archaeological record up to that point had prepared researchers for it. But Price's analysis, as impressive as it was, only scratched the surface. The real revelations came in the 21st century. In 2005, an international team of researchers formed the Antikythera Mechanism research project, bringing together experts from institutions across the United Kingdom, Greece, and the United States. They applied two new imaging technologies to the fragments: polynomial texture mapping, which could reveal surface details invisible to the naked eye, and X-ray computed tomography, essentially a CT scan, which could look inside the corroded fragments and reconstruct the interior gear systems in 3 dimensions. The results were stunning. The team was able to read thousands of new inscriptions hidden beneath the surface. We identify gear configurations that Price had not detected and reconstruct the mechanics of the back dials in far greater detail than had previously been possible. They confirmed that the Saros dial on the back of the device did not just predict eclipses, it color-coded them using small engraved symbols to indicate the type of eclipse, its magnitude, and the time of day it would be visible. This was not a simple mechanical calendar. This was a sophisticated predictive system encoding centuries of accumulated Greek astronomical data into a portable mechanical device. Then, in 2021, a team from University College London, led by researcher Tony Freeth, published a landmark paper in the journal Scientific Reports. Using the 2005 imaging data combined with new analysis of the inscriptions, Freeth's team proposed the first complete reconstruction of the mechanism's front face, the portion that Price had only partially understood. Their reconstruction suggested that the front of the device was a full planetarium, a miniature moving model of the solar system, showing the positions of all 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, along with the Sun and Moon, all moving in real time as the user turned the hand crank. The engineering required to achieve this was remarkable. To accurately model the irregular orbit of the Moon, which speeds up and slows down as it moves closer to and farther from the Earth, the device used a mechanism involving a pin attached to a small gear that rotated inside a slightly off-center slot. as the pin moved through the slot, so it created a variable speed output that closely approximated the actual observed motion of the moon in the sky. This is a mechanical solution to an astronomical problem that required both a deep understanding of observational astronomy and genuine creative engineering ingenuity. Nothing else like it has ever been found. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Antikythera mechanism, not just that it existed, but that it appears to have been unique. In the entire archaeological record, across all of the Roman and Greek world, no other object of even remotely comparable mechanical complexity has been discovered. There are ancient instruments, sundials, astrolabes, water clocks. But the gap between those objects and the Antikythera mechanism is enormous. It is as if one very advanced version of something was built once, or used for a while, and then the knowledge of how to build it simply vanished. The coins found with the shipwreck date the sinking to somewhere between 70 and 60 BCE. The style of the inscriptions on the mechanism itself suggests it was built slightly earlier, possibly in the late 2nd or early 1st century BCE, and perhaps on the island of Rhodes, which was a known center of Greek astronomical study at the time. The ship carrying it appears to have been transporting luxury goods and treasures, possibly looted during the Roman conquest of Greece. The mechanism may have been on its way to Rome to be displayed as a curiosity or presented to a powerful patron. It never arrived. The ship went down somewhere between Rhodes and Rome, settled onto a rocky ledge near an unnamed island, and the most sophisticated device in the ancient world spent the next 2,000 years resting in the dark at the bottom of the sea. The Antikythera mechanism is currently housed in a dedicated display at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. What remains of it, 82 fragments of bronze, many no larger than a thumbnail, tells a story about ancient human capability that still challenges everything we assume about the past. The technology existed, the knowledge existed, and then, somehow, it was lost so completely that when researchers found it again a century ago, no one in the world knew what it was. There is a book sitting in a climate-controlled vault at Yale University. It has been there since 1969. Before that, it passed through the hands of emperors, alchemists, Jesuit scholars, antique dealers, and some of the most brilliant codebreakers who ever lived. Every single one of them failed to understand it. The book has no confirmed title, no confirmed author, no confirmed language, no confirmed date of composition. Its pages are filled with writing that no one has ever been able to read and illustrations of plants that no one has ever been able to identify. It is 600 years old, and it is, by most measures, the most mysterious written object in human history. It is called the Voynich Manuscript. The story of how it entered the modern world begins in 1912, when a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich visited the Jesuit college of Villa Mondragone, a large estate in Frascati, just outside Rome, Italy. The Jesuits were quietly selling off parts of their rare book collection to raise funds, and Voynich, who dealt in rare and unusual manuscripts, was there to browse. Among the items he purchased was a thick, water-stained codex of around 240 pages, written on vellum, thin, treated animal skin used as writing material before paper became common in Europe. The text inside was handwritten, densely packed and arranged in flowing lines from left to right. But Voynich, who was fluent in multiple languages and highly experienced in ancient manuscripts, could not read a single word. Not because the handwriting was unclear, because the language itself was entirely unknown. He brought it back. He showed it to colleagues and ignited a mystery that has never been solved. The manuscript is now catalogued at Yale's Binecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library as MS 408. Carbon dating, conducted by the University of Arizona in 2009, placed the creation of the vellum between 1404 and 1438. That puts the physical material of the book firmly in the early 15th century. but the text written on it could have been copied from an older source, a translation of something much more ancient, pressed onto new pages by a scribe who may or may not have understood it themselves. The manuscript is divided into several distinct sections, each with its own visual theme. The first and largest section is botanical. It contains drawings of approximately 113 different plants, their roots, stems, leaves, and flowers rendered in clear, careful detail. Not one of these plants has been reliably matched to any known species, living or extinct. Some researchers have noted structural similarities to plants native to Central America, which would push the manuscript's origin to after 1492. But the carbon dating firmly contradicts this. Others have looked for European or Middle Eastern medicinal herbs and found only vague resemblances, never a definitive match. The second major section is what researchers call the astronomical or cosmological section. It contains circular diagrams, wheels within wheels, marked with symbols and text that appear to show the sun, the moon, and the signs of the zodiac. Some of the circular charts fold out across multiple pages, forming large panoramas of sky or earth that have the appearance of astronomical maps but cannot be decoded. Then there is the biological section, and this is where the manuscript becomes genuinely strange. Page after page shows small naked human figures, almost all female, submerged in pools, pipes, and tubes of green liquid. The figures are connected by an elaborate network of channels and funnels. The pools are sometimes shown inside organic-looking containers that resemble cells or organs. Some researchers believe this section describes a form of ancient medicine or reproductive anatomy. Others suggest it could be a visualization of a cosmological or spiritual system using the human body as a metaphor. No interpretation has held up under rigorous scrutiny. The fourth section is pharmaceutical in nature, drawings of containers, jars, and plants arranged in a way that suggests a catalogue of medicinal substances. The fifth and final section, called the recipes section, contains short paragraphs marked at the beginning with small star-like symbols, as if each entry is a separate item in a list. Throughout all of these sections, the text flows consistently and confidently. There is no hesitation in the handwriting. The characters are formed cleanly and uniformly, suggesting a scribe who was fully comfortable writing this script, whatever it was. The script itself, commonly called Voynich by researchers, contains approximately 25 to 30 distinct characters. Words are formed from combinations of these characters, and the words follow patterns consistent with a real grammar. They have beginnings, middles, and endings that behave the way words in natural languages behave. Certain characters appear only at the start of words, others appear only in the middle or at the end. The distribution of word lengths across the manuscript follows a mathematical rule called Zipf's law, which holds true for virtually every known human language, but not for random or nonsense text. In other words, statistically, the Voynich Manuscript behaves like a real language. It has the shape of meaning. But no one can find the meaning inside it. This is what makes it so different from a simple code or a hoax. People who encode secret messages leave structures that can, with enough effort, be unraveled. The world's best codebreakers have tried. During World War I, military intelligence analysts examined it. During World War II, William Friedman, the American cryptanalyst who played a key role in breaking the Japanese military code, spent years studying the manuscript on and off, filling notebooks with analysis. John Tiltman, the senior British codebreaker who worked at Bletchley Park, also gave it serious attention and admitted defeat. The US National Security Agency has studied it. Every approach, frequency analysis, pattern matching, linguistic modeling, machine learning, has produced theories but no verified translation. The manuscript's history before Voynich is itself a puzzle layered inside a puzzle. The oldest documented evidence connects it to the court of Emperor Rudolf II of Bohemia, who ruled from Prague in the late 16th century. Rudolf was famously obsessed with the occult, alchemy, and esoteric knowledge, and a later letter from 1666 suggests he purchased the manuscript for the extraordinary sum of 600 gold ducats, a price that reflected not just rarity, but genuine perceived value. After Rudolf's death, the manuscript passed to a man named Jacobus Göbekli Tepe, his personal physician. After that, it went to a Prague scholar named Georg Baresch, who spent decades trying to decode it and wrote letters to the famous Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome begging for help. Kircher, one of the most learned men of the 17th century, apparently never replied with a solution. After Baresch's death, the manuscript was passed to another scholar named Johannes Marcus Marci, who sent it to Kircher along with a covering letter in 1666. That letter survives. It mentions the Rudolf II purchase story and adds one other detail. Someone believed at the time that the manuscript had been written by the 13th century English friar and philosopher Roger Bacon, in a man known for encrypted writing and an obsessive interest in optics and natural science. That theory has since been largely abandoned. Bacon died in 1292, and the carbon dating puts the vellum more than a century after his death. But the letter gives us a clear picture of how the manuscript was perceived, even in the 1600s, as something ancient, strange, and genuinely beyond explanation. Since Voynich acquired it, the theories have multiplied. In 2003, computer scientist Gordon Rugg demonstrated that a device called a cardan grill, a card with holes cut into it placed over a grid of syllables, could generate text with many of the same statistical properties as Voynichese, suggesting the whole thing might be an elaborate, meaningless hoax designed to fool collectors. But this theory has been challenged in turn. The sheer volume of the manuscript, 240 pages, and the consistency of its internal structure make a pure hoax increasingly hard to sustain as an explanation. A 2019 computational study by researcher Greg Kondrak at the University of Alberta used machine learning to analyze the text and suggested the most probable underlying language was Arabic, though this finding was met with significant skepticism from linguists. A 2022 proposal by researcher Gerard Cheshire suggested the manuscript was written in a form of Proto-Romance language, combining elements of early Italian, Spanish, and Latin. But this too was rejected by most scholars as unverifiable. As of 2026, the Voynich manuscript remains exactly what it has been for over 600 years. A book that someone wrote with care and purpose, that no living person has ever been able to read. The knowledge inside it, if it is knowledge, has been sitting in plain sight for centuries, locked behind a language that either no longer exists or was deliberately designed to be understood only by those who already knew the key. The book is real, the writing is real, the mystery is completely, stubbornly, and magnificently unsolved. In 1929, a group of workers was cleaning and restoring the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey, the vast, centuries-old residence of the Ottoman sultans. In a dusty, rarely visited room, tucked among old materials that had not been touched in years, they found a fragment of a map. It was drawn on a single piece of gazelle skin, roughly 90 by 65 centimeters. The colors had faded, but the lines were still visible: coastlines, islands, sea monsters drawn in the ocean margins, and dense handwritten notes in Ottoman Turkish filling the spaces between the landmasses. In the lower right corner of the map was a date and a name. The year 1513, the name Piri Reis. The rediscovery was immediately recognized as significant. Piri Reis, whose full name was Haji Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, was one of the most accomplished sailors and geographers the Ottoman Empire ever produced. Born around 1470, he spent decades at sea, fighting in naval battles across the Mediterranean and studying the coastlines and currents of every body of water he crossed. He wrote the Kitab-ı Bahriye, the Book of Navigation, a massive, beautifully illustrated encyclopedia of maritime knowledge that is still considered one of the finest cartographic works of the 16th century. He rose to the rank of admiral and commanded fleets in the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. He was, by any measure, a serious and credible figure. The 1513 map, which survives as only about 1/3 of what was apparently a much larger original, shows the western coast of Europe, the full western coast of Africa, and a remarkably accurate depiction of the eastern coastline of South America, all drawn just 20 years after Columbus's first voyage. This alone made it historically valuable. But when scholars began looking more carefully at the lower portion of the map, they found something that has never been cleanly explained. Stretching across the bottom of the surviving fragment is a long curved landmass. It runs roughly east to west, separated from the tip of South America by a narrow channel of open sea. It has bays, inlets, and a defined coastline. Piri Reis annotated this landmass in his marginal notes, describing it as a warm land with an abundance of snakes, and noting that it had been discovered by Portuguese sailors who explored deep into the south. The problem is straightforward. No continent matching this description and position should appear on a map from 1513. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, when Russian explorer Fabian von Bellingshausen and British naval officer Edward Bransfield independently sighted the continent's coastline within weeks of each other. For more than 3 centuries before that, Antarctica simply did not exist in the Western geographical record. It was theorized as a possibility, an imagined southern counterweight to the landmasses of the Northern Hemisphere, but no one had seen it, mapped it, or named it. And yet there it appeared to be, on a map drawn 307 years before its official discovery. Piri Reis himself, in the notes written directly onto the map, gave a partial explanation. He wrote that the 1513 map was compiled from approximately 20 older source maps. Some of these, he stated, came from Arab, Portuguese, and Spanish sources, but others, he claimed, dated from the time of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who built an empire stretching from Greece to northwestern India in the 4th century BCE. This would put some of the source material at roughly 2,300 years old at the time Piri Reis was working. Where those ancient maps came from and who originally drew them, he did not say. The map sat in relative obscurity until the 1960s, when an American history professor named Charles Hapgood began examining it closely. Hapgood taught at Keene State College in New Hampshire and had developed a broad, unconventional theory about the ancient world, specifically a hypothesis he called Earth crust displacement, which proposed that the outer shell of the Earth had shifted dramatically during prehistoric times, rapidly relocating entire continents relative to the poles. Albert Einstein, who was a personal correspondent of Hapgood's, had written a cautiously positive preface for an earlier Hapgood book, calling the idea worth serious consideration. In 1966, Hapgood published Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, in which he argued that the Piri Reis map and several other historical charts were copies of cartographic knowledge produced by an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization, a people with global maritime capability and sophisticated astronomical tools who lived more than 10,000 years ago before the last great ice age ended and sea levels rose. In support of his theory, Hapgood reached out to the US, the Air Force Strategic Air Command, asking their cartographers to compare the lower section of the Piri Reis map with modern geographical data on Antarctica. The response, written in 1960 by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Zer Ohlmeyer, was remarkable in its candor. The letter stated that the lower portion of the Piri Reis map, quote, agrees very remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the Antarctic in 1949. The seismic survey Ohlmeyer referenced had been conducted as part of Operation High Jump and follow-up scientific expeditions, and it had for the first time revealed what Antarctica's coastline looked like beneath the ice sheet, a topography that had been hidden under kilometers of glacial ice for thousands of years. The Air Force letter was not an endorsement of Hapgood's lost civilization theory. Ohlmeyer was simply acknowledging an observable correspondence between the map and the modern data, but it was enough to keep the debate alive and growing. The mainstream response to all of this is measured and consistent. Most historians and cartographic scholars argue that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is not Antarctica at all. It is, they say, an extended and distorted representation of the South American coastline. A cartographic error of the kind that was very common in 16th century maps, where the southern tip of South America was frequently misrepresented. The concept of a large southern continent, called Terra Australis Incognita, or the unknown southern land, was also a standard feature of European cartography for centuries before Antarctica's discovery. Mapmakers routinely included a speculative landmass at the bottom of their maps, partly for balance and partly because ancient Greek philosophers had theorized its existence on geometric grounds. In 2000, cartographic historian Gregory Mackintosh published a detailed scholarly analysis of the Piri Reis map in which he argued precisely this, that the lower landmass is a continuation of South America bent eastward by the accumulated mapping errors of the source charts Piri Reis was working from, and that the resemblance to Antarctica is superficial and selective rather than precise. Mackintosh noted that the Piri Reis map also contains significant errors in other areas. The proportions of the Atlantic Ocean are off, and the Caribbean appears in a compressed and distorted form, suggesting the source maps Piri Reis used were themselves imprecise and that the whole product should be understood within the context of 16th century cartographic standards, not compared directly to modern satellite imagery. This is the point where the debate tends to stall. Both sides are working from the same physical object, but they are applying very different standards of comparison and very different assumptions about what is and is not possible in the ancient world. What makes the Piri Reis map impossible to simply set aside is the margin note about the ancient source maps. If those notes are truthful, if Piri Reis really was copying from charts that traced back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier, then the question is not just what the map shows, but who made the original version and how they knew what they apparently knew. A lost set of ancient source maps, now gone, is not provable, but it is not impossible either. Ancient maritime trade routes stretched across the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean for thousands of years before the Christian era. Knowledge of southern lands could have circulated and been recorded in documents that did not survive into the modern world. Piri Reis himself did not live to see the debate his map would eventually inspire. In 1553, at approximately 80 years of age, he was executed by order of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent on charges of military disobedience following a failed campaign in the Persian Gulf. His books and maps survived him. A second world map he drew in 1528, showing the Caribbean and North American coast in greater detail, also survives and is held in Istanbul. The 1513 map, the one found in that dusty palace room, currently resides in the library of the Topkapi Palace Museum, where it has been studied, photographed, and argued over for nearly a century since its rediscovery. It does not give up its answers easily, whether it is a remarkable document of 16th century cartographic ambition, a preserved echo of knowledge from a civilization that left no other trace, or something in between. It remains one of the most genuinely puzzling historical artifacts in existence. A map that shows something it shouldn't be able to show. Drawn from sources that no longer exist, by a man who was executed before anyone thought to ask him more questions. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey that changed everything. Not in a dramatic overnight way, not with a single announcement or a headline that swept the world. It changed everything slowly, the way a fracture spreads through stone. quietly at first and then all at once, until the surface you were standing on no longer looks the way it did before. The hill is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, it means Potbelly Hill. It sits in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, about 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, a region that sits in the upper reaches of the ancient Fertile Crescent, the arc of land where the first human civilizations are traditionally believed to have taken root. From the outside, the hill looks unremarkable. Rounded, dry, and windswept, it rises gently above the surrounding plateau. There is nothing about it, at first glance, that suggests anything remarkable is buried inside it. But buried inside it is something that dismantled one of the most deeply held assumptions in the entire history of archaeology. The hill was first noted by researchers in 1963 during a joint archaeological survey carried out by the University of Chicago and Istanbul University. The survey team observed flint fragments and some limestone pieces near the surface and noted the site in their records. But they identified the scattered stones as the remnants of a medieval cemetery and moved on. The site was documented, catalogued, and largely forgotten. It sat untouched for more than 30 years. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, working with the German Archaeological Institute, they came across the 1963 survey notes and decided the site deserved another look. Schmidt had spent years working at Neolithic sites in the region and had developed a sharp eye for the kind of flint tools that belonged to the Stone Age rather than the medieval period. When he visited Göbekli Tepe and looked at what was scattered across the surface, he immediately recognized the difference. These were not medieval remains. These were Neolithic. Schmidt began excavations the following year, in 1995. What emerged from the earth over the years that followed reshaped the entire field of prehistoric archaeology. Beneath the surface of the hill, arranged in a series of overlapping circular enclosures, were pillars. Enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, each one quarried from the bedrock of the surrounding plateau and erected upright within rings of smaller surrounding stones. Some of the pillars in the most excavated enclosures stand over 5.5 meters tall. Some weigh up to 20 tons. They were cut and shaped using only flint tools. The people who built this place had no metal of any kind. No copper, no bronze, no iron. Just stone tools and an organizational capability that modern researchers are still struggling to fully account for. The pillars were not plain. They were covered in carvings, foxes, snakes, boars, vultures, cranes, gazelles, aurochs, the wild ancestor of modern cattle, scorpions, spiders, ducks. The animal imagery is rich, varied, and executed with a skill and confidence that speaks to a long tradition of artistic craft. With some of the larger central pillars in each enclosure have something even more striking carved into them, the outline of human arms running down their sides with hands and fingers reaching toward the base. These pillars, many researchers now believe, were not abstract columns. They were stylized representations of large, powerful human-like figures, perhaps ancestors, perhaps deities, perhaps both. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the site placed its construction at approximately 9,600 to 8,200 BCE. That is roughly 11,500 to 12,000 years ago. Stonehenge, which people often think of as the oldest great monument, was built around 3000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. The earliest known city-states of ancient Mesopotamia arose around 4000 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates all of them by thousands of years. But the most disorienting discovery was not the age of the site, it was who built it. There is no evidence at Göbekli Tepe, from its earliest layers, of permanent habitation. No hearths arranged for regular cooking, No storage pits for grain, no evidence of domesticated animals, no agricultural residue. The people who came here, who hauled 20-ton stones across rough terrain and carved them with flint chisels, were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, nomadic people who moved with the seasons, following herds and gathering wild plants with no fixed home. This was not supposed to be possible. The accepted model of human development, the one that had been taught for generations, it went in a specific order. First, humans settle down and farm, then they build villages, then they develop religion and monumental architecture. The idea was that surplus food from agriculture gave people the time and resources to build temples and develop complex spiritual practices. In short, civilization created religion. Göbekli Tepe suggested the opposite. Here was a monumental religious or ceremonial site built by people who were not yet farming, not yet settled, not yet civilized in the traditional sense. And yet they were organized enough to gather in large numbers, coordinate complex construction, and maintain a site of extraordinary scale and sophistication across many generations. Klaus Schmidt himself summed it up in a phrase that has since become widely quoted. First came the temple, then the city. Some researchers have taken this further, arguing that Göbekli Tepe may actually explain why agriculture developed in this region in the first place. Feeding thousands of workers who gathered periodically at the site would have required enormous quantities of food, far more than hunting alone could reliably supply. The pressure to feed large periodic communal gatherings may have been the very force that drove early humans in this region to begin deliberately cultivating crops and domesticating animals. If this is correct, then Göbekli Tepe was not a product of civilization. It was one of civilization's causes. The site was not abandoned gradually, it was buried. Around 8000 BCE, after what appears to have been centuries of active use, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately filled in. The builders carried rubble, soil, flint tools, animal bones, and stone fragments into the enclosures and packed them tightly. The process was systematic. It was not the slow accumulation of sediment over time. It was a rapid, intentional act of concealment. Within a relatively short period, the entire complex was swallowed by the hill it stood on. Why? This question has no agreed answer. Schmidt believed it may have been a form of ritual closure, a ceremonial ending of one phase of the site's sacred life, perhaps before a new phase began. Others have proposed it was protection, a way of preserving the site against destruction by enemies or the elements. Some researchers note that the act of deliberate burial is itself a known Neolithic practice in this region, associated with the symbolic death and renewal of sacred spaces. Whatever the reason, the burial was extraordinarily effective. The infill preserved the carvings on the pillars in near-perfect condition, shielding them from thousands of years of erosion. The site contains at least 20 circular enclosures based on geophysical survey data. As of 2026, fewer than 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. What the remaining 95% contains is unknown. Some researchers have identified potentially significant astronomical alignments within the enclosures. Italian astrophysicist Giulio Magli proposed that certain enclosures appear aligned with the rising position of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, as it would have appeared around 9100 BCE. Separately, researcher Andrew Collins has proposed alignments with the Cygnus constellation. These theories remain debated. One particularly striking carved pillar, known among researchers as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, shows a headless human figure, a large vulture, a scorpion, and a series of animals. In 2017, researcher Martin Sweatman published a paper proposing that the imagery on this pillar is a star chart recording a major comet impact event around 10,950 BCE, an event that some scientists believe may be linked to a period of rapid global cooling called the Younger Dryas. This interpretation is speculative, but it has been taken seriously enough to generate academic responses and follow-up analysis. Klaus Schmidt died suddenly in 2014 while on a summer break from the dig, leaving his life's work unfinished. Excavations have continued under the direction of archaeologist Lee Clare, also from the German Archaeological Institute. In 2018, UNESCO added Göbekli Tepe to its World Heritage List, acknowledging the site as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. In the surrounding region, more sites have been found. Karahan Tepe, located about 35 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, has revealed similar T-shaped pillars, along with carvings of human heads emerging directly from bedrock, a detail not seen at Göbekli Tepe itself. The Turkish government has launched a broader initiative called the Taş Tepeler Project, Stone Hills, which is systematically investigating at least 12 similar Neolithic sites across the same landscape. The picture emerging from all of this work is of a rich, widespread, and deeply organized prehistoric culture that existed in this region long before any textbook said it should have. The hill that looked unremarkable from the outside turned out to contain the oldest known complex religious architecture on Earth, built by people who were supposed to be too primitive to build it. Buried deliberately by people who understood, in some way, what they had made and wanted to keep it, and the vast majority of it is still in the ground. It was a small thing, easy to overlook, the kind of object that, in most circumstances, would have been catalogued, boxed, and stored in a museum drawer without a second thought. It was a clay jar, about 13 centimeters tall, roughly the height of a large coffee mug. Reddish-brown, undecorated, sealed at the top with a plug of dark asphalt. Unremarkable in almost every way except for what was inside it. Nested within the jar was a hollow cylinder made of copper, about 9 centimeters long and 2.6 centimeters wide, its base capped with a copper disc. Pushed down through the center of that copper cylinder was a thin iron rod. Between the rod and the cylinder walls, traces of a dried, acidic residue remained, possibly the remnants of grape juice, vinegar, or fermented wine. The iron rod itself showed patterns of corrosion entirely consistent with prolonged exposure to acid. When Wilhelm König, a German archaeologist working at a site called Kujut Rabu near the ancient Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, located southeast of modern Baghdad in Iraq, examined this object in 1936, he did not see a storage jar. He saw a battery. König had a background in both archaeology and the natural sciences, and the configuration of materials inside the jar was immediately familiar to him. An iron rod inside a copper cylinder surrounded by an acidic liquid. This was the exact arrangement of materials needed to produce a galvanic cell, the basic electrochemical unit that generates electrical current through a chemical reaction between two different metals and an acidic electrolyte. In 1938, König published a paper in a German scientific journal with a title that posed the question directly. Ein galvanisches Element aus der Partherzeit, a galvanic cell from the Parthian period. The Parthian Empire controlled much of Mesopotamia and Persia from roughly 250 BCE to 224 CE. The Jar König examined dated to somewhere within that period, making it approximately 2,000 years old. Alessandro Volta, the Italian physicist who invented the first recognizable battery, his famous voltaic pile, a stack of alternating zinc and copper discs separated by brine-soaked cloth, built his device in 1800. If König was right, the Baghdad battery predated Volta's invention by 2 full millennia. The archaeological community received König's 1938 paper with cautious skepticism, and the outbreak of World War II the following year buried the subject entirely for years. But the question he raised never fully went away. In the 1940s, Willard Gray, an engineer at the General Electric High Voltage Laboratory in the United States, constructed a working replica of the Baghdad jar using grape juice as the electrolyte and confirmed that it produced a small but measurable electrical voltage. The device worked. Whatever the ancient makers had intended, the design functioned as a power source. The question of what it was used for has driven decades of competing theories. The most prominent explanation, and the one that captured the most public attention when it emerged, is the electroplating theory. Electroplating is the process of using electrical current to deposit a thin layer of one metal onto the surface of another. Today, it is used industrially to apply chrome to car parts, gold to jewelry, and silver to cutlery. In the ancient world, a similar result, a thin, even metallic coating on an object, was highly valued for both aesthetic and religious reasons. Koenig himself suggested this application, proposing that multiple jars could have been connected together in series, with their combined voltages used to plate decorative or ceremonial objects with gold or silver. This theory gained significant traction in 1978 when Arne Egebrecht, a curator at the Roma and Palazius Museum in Hildesheim, Germany, built a replica battery and claimed to have successfully silver-plated a small statue using it. The demonstration attracted international attention. However, Egebrecht's results were never independently replicated or formally verified in a peer-reviewed context, which left the electroplating claim sitting in an uncomfortable space, plausible but not proven. The most widely publicized modern test came in 2005 when the popular American television program Mythbusters constructed replicas of the Baghdad battery and ran a series of experiments. Using an acidic grape juice solution as the electrolyte, the Mythbusters team successfully used a replica to electroplate a small metal object with a thin layer of gold. The experiment demonstrated that the basic principle worked. It did not prove that the ancient object was intentionally built for this purpose, but it showed conclusively that it could have been. A 2006 analysis published in Chemistry World took the electrochemical case a step further. Researchers proposed that the original Baghdad jar may not have functioned alone. They suggested it could have been one half of a two-cell system. Two jars connected together, potentially doubling the output voltage and making the device far more practical for metalworking applications. King also noted during his original study that other clay jars with similar internal configurations had been found in storage at the Baghdad Museum from different archaeological sites in the region, suggesting the Baghdad jar was not an isolated accident, but possibly part of a broader, repeated pattern of manufacture. And yet the skeptics have a serious point to make, and it deserves a fair hearing. Not a single ancient text from the Parthian period or from any other ancient Mesopotamian culture contains any reference to electricity, electrical current, or electroplating in electrochemical terms. The vast written record of Mesopotamian civilization covers everything from tax records to medical prescriptions to astronomical observations, and nowhere in it is there a description of generating electrical current from a metal and acid arrangement. No wires, connection terminals, or electrical conducting elements have ever been found alongside any of the Baghdad jars. If these devices were used for electroplating, the complete absence of supporting equipment and documentation is very difficult to explain. Mainstream archaeologists also point out that the even metallic coatings found on some ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian metalwork, the feature most often cited as evidence of ancient electroplating, can be fully explained by fire gilding, a well-documented ancient technique that uses mercury and heat to bond a thin layer of gold to a metal surface. This process was used extensively in the ancient world and leaves results visually similar to electroplated surfaces. There is no need to invoke electrochemistry to explain these objects when a known and documented technique produces the same result. The alternative theories for the Baghdad jar are more modest. One proposal is that it was used to store sacred scrolls. The acidic environment inside a sealed clay jar would have helped preserve organic material like papyrus or leather over long periods. And another is simpler still. It was a storage vessel, and the copper cylinder and iron rod were simply objects that happened to be stored inside it at the time of burial, with no intentional relationship to each other or to the acidic residue. What makes the Baghdad battery genuinely interesting, beyond the specific debate about its purpose, is what it sits alongside in the broader history of human knowledge about electricity. Ancient peoples were not completely unaware that certain natural phenomena involved forces resembling what we now understand as electricity. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, described the torpedo fish, a type of electric ray, and noted its ability to produce a numbing sensation in anything that touched it. The ancient Egyptians knew the electric catfish of the Nile, which generates shocks of up to 450 volts, and depicted it in tomb paintings going back to 3100 BCE. Static electricity, produced by rubbing amber against fur, was known to the ancient Greeks. The Greek word for amber, electron, is the root of our word electricity. The awareness that nature contained forces that could shock, numb, or animate was part of ancient knowledge. Whether anyone systematically harnessed that awareness into a constructed device is the question the Baghdad jar poses without answering. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was extensively looted. In the chaos of those days, thousands of irreplaceable artifacts vanished from the museum's collections. The Baghdad battery was among the objects feared lost. It was subsequently recovered, and it currently remains in the Iraq Museum. Though ongoing regional instability has complicated the kind of sustained scientific access that would allow for modern, high-resolution analysis using techniques comparable to what was applied to the Antikythera Mechanism. That access has never come. The full picture of what the Baghdad jar was, who made it, and what it was used for remains incomplete. What we know for certain is this. A 2,000-year-old clay jar from a dig in Iraq contains exactly the materials needed to generate electrical current. Whether that was an accident of storage or a deliberate act of ancient engineering is a question that archaeology has not yet answered, and may not answer for a long time. The Nazca Desert in southern Peru is one of the driest places on Earth. It sits at the edge of the Andes foothills, where the mountains give way to a long, flat coastal plain that receives almost no rainfall. The average annual precipitation here is less than half a centimeter. There is almost no wind. The temperature barely changes from season to season. The surface of the desert is covered in a thin layer of dark reddish-brown pebbles, iron-stained by centuries of sun exposure, sitting over a pale yellowish-white ground below. It is, in most ways, a lifeless and featureless place. And yet, someone chose this exact location, this specific empty, windless plateau, to make the largest collection of drawings ever created by human hands. The Nazca lines stretch across approximately 500 square kilometers of desert floor in the Ica region of southern Peru. They were made by a simple but deliberate process. The dark surface pebbles were removed and piled into low borders on either side, exposing the lighter ground beneath. The contrast between the pale exposed surface and the darker surrounding desert creates lines that are clearly visible from above. On the ground, most of them are nearly impossible to recognize as anything other than shallow ditches. From the air, they become something else entirely. There is a hummingbird with a wingspan of 96 meters, a condor stretching nearly 135 meters from wingtip to wingtip, a spider approximately 46 meters long, drawn in a single continuous line, a monkey with a tightly spiraling tail, about 93 meters across, a whale, a dog, a lizard. Though part of the lizard's tail was cut through when the Pan American Highway was built in the 1940s before anyone realized what was beneath it. There are hands, trees, flowers, and a series of humanoid figures, including one carved into the slope of a hill, about 30 meters tall with an oversized rounded head and arms raised outward, that has been nicknamed the astronaut or the owlman, depending on the researcher. Between and among these animal and human figures are thousands of straight lines, spirals, trapezoids, rectangles, and triangles. Some of the geometric lines run in perfectly straight paths for more than 40 kilometers, cutting directly across the uneven terrain, over hills, across gullies, through ridges, without deviating. The straightness is one of the features that has generated the most fascination. Maintaining a geometrically perfect line across 40 kilometers of irregular landscape using only pre-industrial tools is not a trivial challenge. The lines were created by the Nazca culture, a civilization that flourished in this region of Peru from roughly 100 BCE to 800 CE. But some of the figures, particularly smaller humanoid drawings found on the edges of the plateau, predate the classic Nazca period and are attributed to the earlier Paracas culture, which occupied the region from around 400 to 200 BCE. The desert's extreme dryness and the near-total absence of wind have preserved all of these images with remarkable fidelity for more than 2,000 years. They were largely unknown to the outside world until the age of aviation. A Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Zespe noticed some of the lines during fieldwork in 1927, but he assumed they were irrigation channels. It was not until commercial flights began passing over the region in the 1920s and 1930s that the true scale and complexity of the drawings became apparent to the wider world. The first systematic aerial study was conducted by American historian Paul Kosok in 1939. Kosok made a discovery that would shape the interpretation of the lines for decades. On the evening of June 22nd, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, he noticed that a straight line on the Nazca Plateau pointed directly toward the setting sun. Standing at the end of one of the ancient lines, watching the sun go down exactly along its length, Kosok described the Nazca Plain as the largest astronomy book in the world. This observation brought the lines to the attention of Maria Reiche, a German mathematician and archaeologist living in Peru, who would spend the next half-century of her life studying, mapping, and protecting them. Reiche devoted herself to the theory that the Nazca lines were a massive astronomical calendar, a system of markers pointing to the positions of the sun, the moon, and specific stars at important times of year. She mapped hundreds of lines by hand, working largely alone in the desert, and proposed that the Nazca people used a standard unit of measurement, approximately 33 centimeters, to plan and scale their designs. She published her research in 1949 and continued working until her death in 1998 at the age of 95. Her house near the site has been preserved as a museum. Reiche's astronomical theory has been both supported and complicated by later research. Archaeoastronomer Anthony Aveni of Colgate University conducted an extensive statistical study of the Nazca lines in the 1980s and found that while some lines do align with astronomical events, the overall pattern is not consistent enough to support the idea of a systematic, coherent astronomical calendar. He concluded that the astronomical alignments, where they exist, may be meaningful, but are likely not the primary organizing principle behind the entire site. Aveni proposed a different theory, one that focuses less on what the lines were pointing toward and more on how they were used. He and his colleagues suggested that the wide trapezoidal areas, some large enough to hold hundreds of people standing side by side, were not drawings meant to be viewed from above, but ritual gathering spaces where people walked, processed, and performed ceremonial activities together. In this interpretation, the lines were sacred pathways, not messages to the sky, but routes through a charged landscape, used in religious practices tied to water, fertility, and the agricultural calendar. The water connection is developed most directly by researcher David Johnson, who in the late 1990s published findings suggesting that many of the straight lines and geometric figures at Nazca follow or point toward underground water sources, subterranean aquifers, and the puquios. the ancient spiral well systems still in use in parts of the Nazca region today. In one of the driest places on Earth, water was not a convenience, it was survival. Johnson's research proposed that the Nazca lines may have functioned as a kind of map or spiritual marking system for water, combining practical knowledge with religious significance in the way many ancient cultures did. Then there is the question of the spider. The Nazca spider figure, drawn in a continuous unbroken line, approximately 46 meters long, appears to represent a specific genus of arachnid called Rhizinulae, a rare, eyeless spider found almost exclusively in the remote, deep rainforests of the Amazon basin, hundreds of kilometers from the Nazca Desert. This species is not native to the coastal desert region. It is not a spider that Nazca people would have encountered in their daily lives. How they knew of it and why they chose to immortalize it on a desert plateau at such extraordinary scale is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. The theory that the lines were landing strips for alien spacecraft, popularized by Swiss author Erich von Däniken in his 1968 bestseller Chariots of the Gods, has been a persistent fixture in popular culture but does not hold up to basic physical scrutiny. The desert surface at Nazca is composed of loose, dry sediment that would be entirely unsuitable as a landing surface for any aircraft. The geometric shapes do not share the consistent orientations, minimum lengths, or parallel configurations of actual runways. And the theory requires positing the existence of an alien civilization that traveled across interstellar space, found Earth, and chose to land on a flat desert in southern Peru, without leaving any physical trace beyond scraped gravel lines. The more interesting mystery is how the lines were made with such precision. Experiments by researchers, including Joe Nickell in 1983, have demonstrated that Nazca-era techniques, wooden stakes, sighting lines of string, and teams of workers removing pebbles row by row, are fully capable of producing the basic shapes and the long straight lines. Nicholl's team successfully replicated a section of a Nazca figure using only tools that would have been available to the Nazca people. The figures, in other words, did not require advanced technology to construct. They required patience, planning, organization, and a clear understanding of geometric scaling. In 2019, researchers from Yamagata University in Japan, using a combination of aerial photography and artificial intelligence-assisted image analysis, announced the discovery of 143 previously unknown geoglyphs on the Nazca Plateau. Many of these were smaller figures, humanoid forms, animals, and hybrid creatures, some predating the classic Nazca period and likely created by the Paracas culture. Further surveys in 2022 added more to the total. The full count of figures at Nazca is still growing. The site was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994. In 2014, it suffered its most publicized act of damage when Greenpeace activists, laying out a large promotional banner near the famous hummingbird figure, walked across an area of undisturbed desert surface and left permanent footprint marks that cannot be erased. The fragility of the site, preserved for 2,000 years by the desert's stillness, is a constant concern. What the Nazca lines were for remains genuinely open. Water maps, star charts, ceremonial walkways, offerings to gods or ancestors visible only from above. None of the current theories fully explains every feature of the site. What is clear is that a culture with no wheels, no metal tools, and no aircraft created one of the most precisely executed and visually extraordinary landscape artworks in human history. And did so with a purpose so deeply embedded in their own world that 2,000 years later we are still trying to understand it. It began, as many of history's most important discoveries do, entirely by accident. In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ididib, his name translates roughly as Muhammad the Wolf, was tending his flock of goats near the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The area is part of the Judean Desert in what is now the West Bank, a bleak, sun-bleached landscape of chalk cliffs and dry wadis sitting below sea level, some of the most inhospitable terrain in the Middle East. One of his goats had wandered off. Looking for it among the cliffs, Muhammad threw a stone into an opening in the rock face to see if the animal had gone inside. Instead of a goat, he heard pottery breaking. Inside the cave were large clay jars, sealed with lids, standing upright in the dim light. Wrapped inside some of the jars, in linen cloth, were bundles of ancient leather and papyrus scrolls, darkened with age but largely intact. Muhammad and his companions brought the scrolls out and eventually made their way to the markets of Bethlehem, where they began offering them for sale. 4 of the scrolls were purchased by Archbishop Samuel of the Syrian Orthodox Monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem for $97. 3 others were acquired by Professor Eliezer Sukenik of Hebrew University, who recognized almost immediately that they were genuinely ancient and of extraordinary significance. Word spread. Archaeologists descended on the area. Between 1947 and 1956, systematic searches of the cliffs above Qumran, the ancient settlement closest to the cave, revealed a total of 11 caves containing manuscript material. The most productive of these was Cave 4, which alone yielded fragments from approximately 500 to 600 different manuscripts. Across all 11 caves, the material represented more than 900 individual documents written on leather, papyrus, and in one remarkable case, copper. The collection contained the oldest known manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. Virtually every book of the Old Testament was represented, some in multiple copies. The most complete of these was the Great Isaiah Scroll, found in Cave 1, a nearly perfect copy of the entire book of Isaiah, dating to approximately 100 BCE, a full 1,000 years older than any previously known Hebrew Bible manuscript. When it was compared to the text of Isaiah used in modern Bibles, the match was extraordinarily close, confirming the stability and careful preservation of the biblical text across 10 centuries of copying. Now, but the biblical manuscripts, remarkable as they were only part of the story. Among the collection were texts that had never appeared in any known canon, tradition, or published religious record. There was the community rule, a detailed set of regulations for a strictly organized Jewish religious community, describing its structure, its rituals, its admission procedures, and its code of discipline. There was the War Scroll, a lengthy text describing an apocalyptic final battle between a group called the Sons of Light and their enemies, the Sons of Darkness, laid out with the detail of a military manual. There was a collection of hymns and prayers called the Hodayot, or Thanksgiving Psalms, written in a deeply personal and emotional voice, unlike anything in the standard biblical canon. There was the Temple Scroll, the longest of all the discovered texts at nearly 9 meters, outlining a detailed blueprint for an idealized Jerusalem temple that differed significantly from both the historical temple and the one described in the Bible. And there was the Copper Scroll, found in Cave 3 in 1952, unique among the collection because it was inscribed on sheets of thin beaten copper rather than organic material. The Copper Scroll describes, in plain and businesslike terms, dozens of specific locations where enormous quantities of gold and silver, totaling, if the figures are taken literally, hundreds of tons, are buried. No treasure matching its descriptions has ever been found. Most scholars believe the scrolls were the library of a Jewish sect called the Essenes, an ascetic community mentioned by ancient writers, including the Jewish historian Josephus, the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, and the Roman writer Pliny the Elder. The Essenes were known for their strict communal life, their ritual purity practices, their rejection of the Jerusalem temple establishment, and their expectation of an imminent end of days. The settlement at Qumran appears to have been their home. When the Roman army marched through the region during the First Jewish-Roman War, destroying Jerusalem and burning the Second Temple in 70 CE, The community seems to have sealed their scrolls in the caves for safekeeping before fleeing or being killed. The scrolls sat in the dark for nearly 2,000 years. Then they were found. And almost immediately, the trouble began. In the early 1950s, an international team of scholars was assembled to work on translating and publishing the scrolls. The team was led by Roland de Vaux, a Dominican priest and director of the École biblique et archéologique française in Jerusalem. His team was composed almost exclusively of Catholic and Protestant Christian scholars. No Jewish scholars were included in the core group. Access to the unpublished manuscript material, and by the late 1950s, the vast majority of the Cave 4 fragments had not been published, was restricted to this small circle. Outside researchers who requested access were denied. Photographs were not released. Progress on publication was extremely slow. By the 1970s, decades after the discovery, most of the Cave 4 material was still unavailable to the wider academic world. Scholars who wanted to work on the texts had to rely on partial transcriptions and second-hand notes circulated within the inner team. The situation generated growing frustration and, eventually, open accusations. The loudest and most persistent voice demanding open access belonged to Herschel Shanks, editor of the Biblical Archaeology Review, who began campaigning publicly in the mid-1980s for the scrolls to be made available to all researchers. Shanks and other critics argued that the access restrictions were not simply a matter of scholarly slowness or logistical difficulty. They were a form of intellectual gatekeeping motivated, at least in part, by the sensitive theological implications of certain texts. The concern, stated explicitly by several prominent scholars, was that some of the unpublished material contained content that blurred the lines between early Jewish and early Christian belief in ways that would be deeply uncomfortable for established religious institutions. The deadlock broke in 1991, simultaneously from two directions. At Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, scholars Ben Zion Wacholder and Martin Abegg used a computer program to reconstruct previously unpublished texts from a concordance, an index of all the words in the scrolls, that had been published years earlier. By working backward from the word index, they were able to reconstruct the texts themselves, entirely without access to the original photographs. They published their results, effectively releasing the content through the back door. At almost the same moment, the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, announced that it was opening its complete photographic archive of all the scrolls to any qualified researcher without restriction. The Huntington had received a full set of photographs years earlier as a backup copy, with no clear understanding at the time that they were bound by the same access restrictions as the originals. Library director William Moffett made the decision to release the photographs on principle, arguing that free access to documents of historical and cultural significance could not be legitimately withheld from the world. The Israeli Antiquities Authority initially threatened legal action. After a brief standoff, they backed down. By 1993, high-resolution photographs of the entire collection were accessible to researchers worldwide. What did the suppressed content actually show? The honest answer is that the scrolls did not contain the explosive theological bombshells that some had feared or hoped they would. There were no lost gospels hidden among the cave documents. The scrolls did not name Jesus or mention early Christianity directly, but what they did reveal was significant in a quieter, more intellectually durable way. The sectarian texts from Qumran showed that many of the concepts previously considered distinctive features of early Christianity — ritual baptism, communal meals with bread and wine, an expected messianic figure, a sharp division between the righteous and the wicked, an imminent apocalyptic reckoning, the language of sons of light — were already circulating within Jewish religious thought before the time of Jesus. This did not mean, as some popular writers have claimed, that Jesus was an Essene or that Christianity was simply borrowed from the Qumran community. The relationship is more nuanced than that, and most scholars reject any direct line of descent. But it demonstrated that the religious world into which Christianity was born was far more varied, complex, and theologically rich than the traditional picture suggested. The teacher of righteousness, a central but unnamed figure in several Qumran texts, described as a divinely inspired leader who was persecuted and opposed by a corrupt establishment, has been compared to various historical figures by different researchers, with no consensus reached. Today, the scrolls are housed at the Shrine of the Book, a specially designed wing of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Since 2012, the Israel Antiquities Authority, in partnership with Google, has made high-resolution digital images of all the scrolls freely available online, fulfilling at last, even if decades late, the principle of open access that Herschel Shanks and others had argued for throughout the 1980s. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not simply a story of ancient texts. It is a story about who controls history, who decides what the world is allowed to know, and what happens when that control is challenged. The knowledge was always there, waiting in the dark of the caves. What took time was not the discovery, it was the willingness to share it. About 60 kilometers north of Luxor, on the west bank of the Nile, there is a temple complex that has stood for more than 2,000 years and remains one of the best preserved religious sites in all of Egypt. The Dendera temple complex was built during the Ptolemaic period, the era of Greek rulers who governed Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great, and was completed and expanded during the reigns of the Roman emperors Augustus and Tiberius. It was dedicated to Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of love, beauty, music, and the sky. The main temple is enormous. Its columns rise over 24 meters. Its walls are covered floor to ceiling in carved and painted hieroglyphic reliefs, and its roof once supported a zodiac ceiling so detailed and so extraordinary that French archaeologists cut it out and shipped it to Paris in 1820, where it now sits in the Louvre. The Dendera zodiac remains one of the oldest and most complete star maps from the ancient world. But it is not the zodiac that has made Dendera famous in alternative history circles. It is something much smaller, much darker, and much harder to explain to everyone's satisfaction. It is what is carved on the walls of the underground crypts. Beneath the main temple, accessible through narrow doorways set into the lower walls of the sanctuary, there are 3 underground corridor chambers, crypts that were used in antiquity for storing sacred objects and cult instruments used in the temple's religious rituals. These chambers were not tourist spaces or public halls. They were functional storage areas, dark and confined, visited only by the temple's priests. Their walls, like nearly every surface in Egyptian temples of this era, are covered in carved reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions. Most of what is carved in the Dendera crypts follows standard Egyptian religious iconography, gods, ritual scenes, protective symbols. But several of the reliefs in the southernmost crypt contain images that are, to say the least, visually unusual. The carvings in question show a series of large, elongated shapes, rounded at one end and tapering at the other, roughly resembling the outline of an oversized light bulb or a flask. Inside each of these shapes, either a serpent stretches along its full length or a lotus flower sits on a long stalk. The bulb-like forms rest on bases that resemble pedestals or column supports. Some of them appear to be connected by a cord or cable-like element to a smaller rectangular box at the base. In several of the reliefs, a human figure stands nearby, appearing to support or interact with the object. To a modern viewer with no background in Egyptology, walking into that crypt and seeing those images for the first time, the resemblance to a specific 19th century scientific device is genuinely startling. That device is the Crookes tube. Invented by British physicist William Crookes in the 1870s, the Crookes tube is a sealed glass vacuum tube with metal electrodes at each end. When connected to a high-voltage electrical source, it produces a glowing luminous plasma inside the glass. One of the foundational experiments that eventually led to the discovery of the electron, the development of X-rays, and modern fluorescent lighting. When you look at a diagram of a Crookes tube alongside a carefully drawn tracing of the Dendera carvings, the similarity in shape is undeniable. Elongated glass form, internal glowing element. Connection to an external power source. The visual parallel is real. The alternative history interpretation of the Dendera reliefs gained wide public attention, largely through the work of two Austrian researchers, Peter Krasser and Reinhard Habeck, who published a book titled Das Licht der Pharaonen, The Light of the Pharaohs, in the 1990s. They argued that the carvings were not mythological imagery, but technical diagrams, schematic representations of actual electrical light sources used by ancient Egyptian priests to illuminate their dark underground crypts. In support of this idea, they pointed to a practical puzzle. The Dendera crypts have no windows, no openings for natural light, and they are located deep within the stone foundations of the temple. If the priests worked in these spaces, storing, retrieving, and caring for sacred objects, how did they see? The standard archaeological answer is oil lamps and torches. These were the primary artificial light sources in the ancient world, and evidence of their use, in the form of soot deposits on ceilings and walls, has been found in many ancient Egyptian spaces. But here, the alternative researchers raised a specific and frequently cited point. The Dendera crypts show remarkably little soot residue for spaces that were supposedly lit by open flame over centuries of use. Austrian electrical engineer Walter Gahn took the argument one step further in the 1990s. Working from the dimensions and proportions of the Dendera carvings, Gahn constructed a physical model of what the relief might represent as a functional device. He built an elongated glass vessel, evacuated it partially of air, filled it with inert gas, and connected it to a power source modeled on the Baghdad battery design. His model, when activated, produced a glowing plasma inside the glass, a working plasma lamp, visually consistent with what is shown in the crypt reliefs. The demonstration was filmed, it circulated widely in documentary programs and online, and it became one of the most cited pieces of evidence in the Dendera light debate. There is, however, a great deal that Gahn's demonstration did not prove. His model was never independently replicated in a controlled scientific context. It was never published in a peer-reviewed journal. And the most fundamental problem with the entire electrical interpretation remained unanswered by his experiment. The hieroglyphic inscriptions surrounding the Dendera reliefs have been fully translated by professional Egyptologists, and they do not describe anything technical. They describe mythology. The texts adjacent to the carvings identify the elongated shapes within the context of established Egyptian religious symbolism. The serpent inside the bulb-like form is identified in the inscriptions as a representation of Nehebkau, or a related primordial serpent, a figure associated in Egyptian cosmology with the moment before creation when the world was dark and formless. The lotus variant represents the primordial lotus, or the sacred flower from which the sun god Ra was said to have emerged at the dawn of creation, bringing light into the world for the first time. The pedestal-like base is a standard artistic representation of the primordial mound, the first solid ground to rise from the waters of chaos. The figure supporting the object is performing a ritual act associated with the resurrection of Osiris. Egyptologist Lanny Bell and other specialists in Ptolemaic religious art have been direct in their assessments. The Dendera reliefs are fully explicable within the established framework of Egyptian religious iconography. Every element in the carvings has a documented parallel elsewhere in Egyptian religious art. The surrounding inscriptions explicitly tell us what the images mean. There is no technical vocabulary, no reference to artificial light, and no term that translates to electricity, lamp, or power source anywhere in the texts. The mainstream argument also addresses the lighting question practically. The crypts at Dendera were not workshops or regular working spaces. They were sealed storage chambers for sacred cult objects, accessed infrequently and ceremonially. The small amount of soot found there is entirely consistent with rare, brief entries with handheld lamps rather than sustained daily use. Mirror relay systems, polished metal mirrors used to redirect sunlight deep into enclosed spaces, have been documented as a technique used in ancient Egypt, and some researchers have proposed they may have been employed at Dendera for specific ritual purposes. The question of whether ancient Egyptians could theoretically have known about battery-type devices is not entirely unreasonable. Ptolemaic Egypt was deeply connected to the Hellenistic world and had active trade and cultural relationships with Mesopotamia, where the Baghdad battery-type objects were produced. But a theoretical possibility of awareness is very different from evidence of use. No battery, no wire, no conducting element, and no textual reference to electrochemical power has ever been found at Dendera or at any other Egyptian temple or tomb. What makes the Dendera light debate so persistent, despite the weight of Egyptological opinion against it, is something worth understanding honestly. The visual resemblance between the carvings and a Crookes tube is not fabricated or exaggerated. Side-by-side comparisons genuinely look compelling to any viewer who has seen a plasma tube. The idea that ancient people possessed technological knowledge that was subsequently lost sits in the same category of emotional appeal as the Antikythera Mechanism and the Baghdad battery. The feeling that history is hiding something, that the official version undersells what human beings are capable of. That feeling, in many cases explored throughout this video, has a genuine basis. The Antikythera Mechanism was real. The Baghdad battery's electrochemical properties are real. But for the Dendera light specifically, the evidence runs in a different direction. The inscriptions tell us what the images mean, clearly and in detail. The images sit within a complete and internally consistent mythological framework that requires no external technical explanation. What the Dendera reliefs most likely show is the Egyptian imagination at its most sophisticated, a cosmological vision of light and creation drawn in stone, in a language of symbols that took centuries to develop and centuries more to decode. The ancient Egyptians were, among many things, some of the most gifted visual storytellers in human history. Sometimes a lotus in an elongated vessel is exactly what the inscription says it is, and sometimes even that is extraordinary enough. Before professional archaeology existed in America, before excavation permits and institutional oversight and peer-reviewed documentation, the land was simply dug. Farmers ploughing new fields, curious locals probing the mounds that dotted the hillsides and river valleys across the eastern half of the continent. Railway construction crews cutting through ancient earthworks to lay track. And with almost every significant dig, beginning roughly in the 1840s and continuing well into the early 1900s, reports came back through the same channels: local newspapers, letters to regional societies, entries in county histories, describing the same unusual thing. The bones found inside these mounds, they said, were very large, in many cases impossibly large. The reports came from across the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys in particular, from the heartland of the ancient mound-building cultures of North America. A skeleton found in a mound in Chillicothe, Ohio, measured at 7 feet 2 inches. Another, unearthed in Indiana, reportedly reached over 8 feet. Accounts in the New York Times from the 1880s and 1890s described multiple discoveries of remains with unusual features: skeletons of exceptional height, skulls with double rows of teeth, bones found alongside sophisticated copper tools, mica ornaments, and elaborate ceremonial grave goods that suggested the buried individuals had held positions of significant power or spiritual importance. The mounds these remains came from were real, and their builders were real. The Adena culture, which flourished from roughly 1000 to 200 BCE in the Ohio River Valley, constructed thousands of burial mounds, earthwork enclosures, and ceremonial monuments across what is now Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The Hopewell culture, which followed from approximately 100 BCE to 500 CE, built an even more extensive network of geometric earthworks, exchange networks, and ceremonial centers across a vast territory. Their largest achievement, the Newark earthworks in central Ohio, was a complex of connected geometric enclosures covering more than 10 square miles, the largest set of geometric earthworks ever constructed anywhere in the ancient world. Later, the Mississippian culture, centered around the settlement of Cahokia near present-day St. Louis, Illinois, built a city that at its peak around 1100 CE held a population larger than contemporary London, anchored by a massive flat-topped pyramid called Monk's Mound that covers more ground area at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. These were not primitive peoples. They were organized, sophisticated civilizations with long-distance trade networks, complex religious systems, and architectural ambitions that still impress modern engineers. The Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, a nearly 400-meter-long effigy of a serpent with a coiled tail and an open mouth, built on a ridgeline, is one of the most extraordinary earthworks ever created by human hands. By the 1880s, a popular but deeply problematic theory had taken hold in American cultural life. The idea that the mounds had not been built by the ancestors of the Native American peoples living in the region, but by a now vanished lost race, sometimes described as white, were sometimes as giants, sometimes as ancient Europeans or Hebrews who had been wiped out before European colonization. This theory served a convenient cultural purpose in post-Civil War America, where dispossessing native peoples of their land was far easier if those lands were portrayed as having once belonged to a superior civilization unrelated to current tribal groups. To settle the question scientifically, the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institution commissioned a systematic survey of the mounds beginning in 1881. The project was led by Cyrus Thomas, an American scientist who had begun his career as an entomologist. Thomas and his team spent over a decade excavating hundreds of mounds, collecting skeletal remains, documenting burial practices, and analyzing cultural artifacts. In 1894, Thomas published his findings in the monumental 12th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology, a report running to nearly 730 pages that comprehensively demolished the lost race theory. The evidence was overwhelming. The mounds had been built by the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples. The pottery styles, the artifact types, the cultural practices, and the skeletal morphology all pointed unambiguously to continuity between the mound builders and the historical native nations. But Thomas's report, for all its thoroughness, did not address the reports of gigantic skeletons. And over the following decades, thousands of skeletal remains collected during the survey and by other institutions and private collectors were transported to Washington and entered into the Smithsonian's Physical Anthropology collection. What happened to them there is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Aleš Hrdlička, a Czech-American physical anthropologist who became the head of the Smithsonian's Division of Physical Anthropology in 1910, spent decades cataloging, studying, and in many cases, debunking the reports of unusual remains. Hrdlička was a rigorous and often abrasive scientist who dismissed claims of giant skeletons with systematic skepticism. He explained most reports of unusual height as the result of measurement error by untrained observers, bone displacement within burial mounds that could make scattered remains appear to represent a single large individual, and the general enthusiasm of 19th-century newspaper culture for sensational stories. His explanations were scientifically grounded, and in the cases where he was able to examine the actual remains, he found no evidence supporting the extreme heights described in newspaper accounts. But Hrdlička was also a man of his time in deeply troubling ways. His collection practices extended far beyond mound builder remains. He acquired thousands of skulls and skeletons from Native American individuals and communities across the country, often through means that would today be considered profoundly unethical, taking remains from recent burial sites, acquiring them through grave-robbing intermediaries, and collecting bodies from battlefields and morgues. His goal was to build a definitive physical database of human racial types, a project rooted in the racial science frameworks that were then mainstream in American academic anthropology, but which have since been thoroughly discredited. In 2023, Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch issued a formal institutional apology for this history of collecting human remains through racist and exploitative methods. The apology was specifically directed at the communities whose ancestors had been taken without consent and held in storage for over a century. It was a recognition of serious institutional wrongdoing, but it was about the collection practices, not about the content of what was collected. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1990, legally required all federal agencies and federally funded museums to inventory their collections of Native American human remains and cultural objects and return them to affiliated tribal nations upon request. The Smithsonian had its own parallel legislation in the form of the National Museum of the American Indian Act of 1989. In the decades following these laws, the Smithsonian repatriated thousands of skeletal remains to tribal communities across the country. Many of those remains were subsequently reburied according to traditional practices. This is the point at which the legitimate historical debate and the conspiracy theory most clearly separate, and where they also most clearly intersect. The legitimate question is this: the Smithsonian collected thousands of skeletal remains from mound sites across North America. Many of those remains were subsequently destroyed during the pre-Nagpra era as part of racist collection practices. Others were repatriated and reburied under Nagpra, making them permanently inaccessible to further scientific examination. The institutional records from this entire period are incomplete. As a direct result, the question of what was collected, what measurements were actually taken, and what conclusions might have been drawn from a modern scientific examination of those remains simply cannot be answered. The evidence no longer exists. This is different from the conspiracy theory. The most extreme version of the story, widely shared online, claims that the Supreme Court ordered the Smithsonian to admit destroying thousands of giant skeletons specifically to suppress evidence that would overturn official human history. Fact-checking organizations including Snopes and Reuters have investigated this claim and found it to be completely fabricated. The story originated with a satirical fake news website and spread without correction. No such Supreme Court ruling exists. No authenticated photograph of a genuinely outsized skeletal remain from a mound builder site has ever been produced. The newspaper reports themselves deserve a measured assessment. They appeared between roughly 1850 and 1920, when American journalism had no ethical standards about fact-checking sensational claims. Many were written by farmers and construction workers with no training in anatomy or measurement. The tallest verified human being in recorded modern history, Robert Wadlow of Alton, Illinois, reached 8 feet 11 inches, a real and documented phenomenon caused by a pituitary gland disorder. Individuals considerably taller than average do exist and have always existed. Finding an unusually tall skeleton in a burial mound would not be scientifically shocking. Finding hundreds of them, consistently measured at 8 or 9 feet, would be. And no credible body of evidence for that consistent pattern has ever been assembled. What remains after all the fact-checking and the conspiracy theory stripping is this: America's most important scientific institution collected thousands of ancient human remains from one of the most fascinating and understudied archaeological cultures in the world, destroyed or lost a significant portion of them through negligence and racist practice, returned much of the rest to communities who reburied them in accordance with their own traditions, and produced incomplete records that leave the full picture permanently unclear. The bones went into the ground twice. The first time, they were placed there by people who cared deeply about the dead. The second time, the reasons were more complicated and far less honorable. And that is perhaps the truest and most unsettling part of the story. Not giants, but the slow, institutional erasure of evidence that no one can now fully reconstruct.